my op-ed today from HartmannReport.com, How to Kill and Get Away with It. You know, if you live in New York State and you lie to the government about your income so that you don't have to pay as much in taxes, you go to prison. In fact, if you're convicted of 17 criminal efforts or crimes, 17, felony crimes of tax fraud, you spend a long time in prison. But the Trump organization, which was just convicted of 17 felony tax fraud convictions, won't spend a day in prison. Instead, they're going to pay a $1.6 million fine. We don't know the exact amount yet. There hasn't been a sentencing hearing, but that's the maximum, which is less money than they made off with by lying to the government for 15 years. When the senior executives of California's private for-profit power utility, PG&E, made the intentional decision to move cash out of the fund, or not to well fund the maintenance of 100-year-old high-tension towers that represented a fire risk, and instead pay themselves bonuses and dividends, they made the decision that people could die. And sure enough, PG&E pleaded guilty to those 84 killings in the 2018 Camp Fire caused by the failure of those very high-tension lines. The judge forced the CEO, Bill Johnson, to come to court and stand in front of him and 84 times say, "Guilty, Your Honor." But nobody's going to go to jail, even though 84 people died. By the way, PG&E at that point in time had been on probation for the previous 2 years for killing 8 people in a poorly maintained gas pipeline, just a little south of there. You know, there's been a lot of conversation on this program and in other venues about America having 2 standards of justice, one for poor, one for rich, one for black, one for white. Well, we have a 3rd standard of justice in America, and that's for corporations. The Supreme Court ruled back in the 1880s, and that's a whole long and weird story that, many of you are familiar with. They didn't actually rule, but then later they did rule. So back in the 1880s, 1890s, that corporations are persons, and therefore they're entitled to rights under the 1st, 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. They've claimed all of those so far, successfully, before the Supreme Court. And yet, as persons, they don't have to pay the penalties of breaking the law. You know, a guy named Alfred Ruff poisoned his wife as part of a scheme to get rich off her life insurance. So did a guy named Dr. Gregory Dennis, who was looking at a $2 million payoff. So did Joshua Hunsicker. He poisoned his wife for $250,000 in life insurance. He used $80,000 of it to buy a boat. David Pettis poisoned his wife for $150,000 in insurance. These guys are bad, and they're all in prison. But the simple fact of the matter is that corporations killed 40 times more Americans last year than did your average crook. Seriously. And they get away with it. I mean, I don't know the names of the guys who made the decision to poison my father with asbestos and cause his death from mesothelioma, or get my brother Stan addicted to tobacco, death from COPD and things associated with it. But I do know that they're not going to go to jail, and that they made a crap load of money. I mean, just like those 4 wife killers, like the Trump organization, like PG&E, the tobacco executives, the asbestos executives, they all did it for money. But the CEOs and senior executives of these corporations, who made a hell of a lot more money than those 4 guys who poisoned their wives or killed their wives for insurance money, they're not going to jail. And this just scratches the surface. I mean, this is a statistic that most Americans don't realize. And I think it frankly deserves more publicity. The coal industry kills more Americans every year than it employs. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the coal industry kills around 52,105 Americans every year. It only employs 51,000 people. The tobacco industry kills more people than it employs every year. It kills 522,000 Americans every year, according to HHS, but it only employs 124,000. Human criminals killed 23,000 Americans last year, roughly. It was 22,000 something, according to the FBI, which only tracks and publishes statistics on human killers. But, you know, according to the statistics that are available, I mean, you know, Lisa Monaco, who is our Assistant Attorney General, she estimates that 20% of all the major corporate crime in America is committed by repeat corporate offenders. They never go to jail. And nobody in our government is keeping track of this. Dick Durbin and Richard Blumenthal, the two Democratic senators, and Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon have introduced legislation that would require the Justice Department to simply maintain a database of corporate criminals. There literally is no government agency that tracks this. The FBI every year publishes a report on all the crime categories committed by humans. How many robberies, how many burglaries, how many murders, how many assaults, how many rapes. The FBI has all those numbers. Ask them how many people were killed by corporations last year. They don't know. How many corporations ripped people off last year? I mean, convicted in court. I'm not talking about speculation. I'm talking about convictions. They don't know. How many billions of dollars? Well, we know broadly corporations robbed us for about $800 billion last year. A whole hell of a lot more than all the criminals in America combined. But we don't know for sure because nobody's compiling these statistics. So when Blumenthal and Durbin and Scanlon got together and said, hey, let's ask the Justice Department to compile these, you know, the FBI to compile these statistics too, not one Republican would go along with it. Not one. How to kill somebody and get away with it? Easy. Incorporate. Now here's the problem with that. If you want to do this, if you want to create a corporation and then have your corporation, you know, kill your obnoxious next door neighbor by having your corporation spray something in their yard or something, your corporation won't be able to get away with it because this concept is called, in law, it's called piercing the corporate veil. It's really easy for companies that only do $1 million a year in business or less. They'll just say, no, that's you. You're just trying to pretend you're a corporation. But the Trump organization only has a half a dozen or a dozen employees at the most. It's a very, very small company. And yet, because it does hundreds of millions of dollars a year in business or billions or whatever it is, they get to keep their corporate veil intact. The bottom line for all this, and my call for action here at the end of this article, is pointing out that in the election that we just completed a couple of weeks ago, Republicans spent months leading up to that election screaming about, wringing their hands about, tearing their sackcloth about crime in America, usually with pictures of black people. Democrats need to be doing the same, only instead of talking about street crime, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Democrats should have a plan for dealing with street crime. But Democrats need to start talking about the real killers and thieves in this nation. The people who are killing 40 times more people than your human criminals, which is the corporate criminals. The people who are stealing $800 billion a year from us, and that's a conservative estimate, the corporate criminals. And I'm telling you, if Democrats start yelling about corporate crime leading up to the 2024 election, America's going to be with them. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders proved this back in 2016. Americans know that this system is corrupt, that it is killing us, that it is robbing us blind, and Democrats should get behind doing something about it and doing it loudly. What do you think?